The night my rich in-laws laughed at me during their luxury dinner party, they had no idea what I had already discovered. DSKLAMR. This video contains a fictional story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are imaginary, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. The day I married Daniel, I knew his world was very different from mine. He came from a family that people admired, envied, and sometimes feared. His parents were known across the city for their wealth and influence. They owned luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, and several high-end properties that stretched from the center of downtown to the most exclusive neighborhoods. Their lives were filled with private parties, designer clothes, and conversations about investments worth millions. My life had always been the opposite. I grew up in a small apartment with my mother. She worked 2 jobs to make sure I could stay in school. There were nights when we had to carefully plan how to spend every dollar, and weekends were often spent helping my mother clean offices or organize files for extra income. We didn't have much, but my mother always taught me something important: respect, honesty, and hard work mattered more than money. When Daniel and I first met, he never cared about any of those differences. He loved that I was simple and honest. He used to say my determination was something he admired. For a long time, I believed his family would eventually see the same qualities in me. I thought that once they got to know me, they would understand that I wasn't trying to take advantage of their wealth. I only loved their son. But the first time I stepped inside their mansion, I realized things would not be that easy. The house stood on top of a quiet hill, surrounded by tall gates and perfectly trimmed gardens. Expensive cars were parked outside, and the marble floors inside the entrance shined so brightly that I almost felt nervous walking on them. Every detail of the house screamed luxury. Huge crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and paintings that probably cost more than my entire childhood apartment covered the walls. Daniel held my hand as we walked inside, trying to comfort me. He knew I was nervous about meeting his parents properly for the first time. "They'll like you once they get to know you," he said softly. I wanted to believe him. But the moment his mother, Victoria, looked at me, something in her expression made my heart sink. She smiled politely, but her eyes slowly moved from my shoes to my simple dress. It wasn't cheap, but it certainly wasn't designer. Compared to the glamorous outfits she and her daughter wore, I looked plain. "Well," she said with a light laugh, "Daniel always had expensive taste." She paused for a moment before adding, "I just didn't realize it would change." The comment sounded friendly on the surface, but everyone at the table seemed to understand the hidden meaning. Daniel's father let out a quiet laugh, and his sister Chloe covered her mouth as if she was trying not to smile too obviously. I tried to ignore it and stayed quiet during dinner. The table was filled with food that looked like it belonged in a luxury restaurant. Servants moved around the room silently, refilling glasses and clearing plates before anyone even asked. Conversations quickly turned toward business deals, investment projects, and luxury vacations in countries I had never even visited. Whenever I tried to join the conversation, the room would go strangely quiet. Sometimes someone would politely nod before changing the topic again. Other times they would exchange small looks with each other, as if they were silently sharing a joke. At one point, Victoria asked me about my job. "So Emily," she said while swirling wine in her glass, "Daniel told us you work in an office." "Yes," I replied calmly. "I'm a financial analyst at a consulting firm." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "How practical," she said slowly. Chloe leaned toward her and whispered something that made both of them laugh softly. Later that evening, when more relatives arrived for drinks, I heard something that made my chest tighten. Victoria was introducing me to one of their wealthy friends. "This is Emily," she said casually. "Daniel has a very kind heart. He's always helping people." Her friend smiled at me politely, but the way Victoria said it made it sound like I was some sort of charity case rather than Daniel's wife. That moment made something very clear. To them, I wasn't part of the family. I was simply the girl who didn't belong. The mocking didn't stop after that night. At family gatherings, they would make small comments about my background. Victoria loved bringing up my childhood in front of guests as if it was an interesting story to entertain people. Chloe would sometimes ask questions that sounded innocent, but were clearly meant to embarrass me. "Oh, Emily," she once said during lunch, "did you ever imagine living in a house like this when you were growing up?" Everyone looked at me, waiting for my answer. I simply smiled and said, "No, but I always imagined building a life I could be proud of." Daniel often tried to defend me, but he also didn't like confronting his family directly. Whenever something uncomfortable happened, he would squeeze my hand under the table or quietly tell me later not to take their behavior too seriously. "They're just used to a certain lifestyle," he would say. "Give them time." But time didn't change anything. If anything, their attitude only became more obvious. Every insult was small enough to sound like a joke, but together they created a clear message. They believed money made them superior, and someone like me would never truly belong in their world. At first, their comments hurt more than I wanted to admit. I would lie awake at night wondering if marrying Daniel had been a mistake. I loved him deeply, but being constantly reminded that I wasn't good enough slowly built a quiet anger inside me. It wasn't loud anger. It was the kind that stays silent, watching and waiting. And although my in-laws believed I was just a simple girl from a poor background, they had absolutely no idea that one day the same woman they laughed at would be the one holding a secret powerful enough to shake the foundation of their perfect, wealthy empire. The months after that first uncomfortable dinner passed slowly, but the atmosphere in Daniel's family never improved. If anything, their behavior toward me became more obvious as time went on. Every family gathering felt like a stage where I was expected to play the role of the outsider. No one openly insulted me in a cruel way, but the small remarks, quiet laughter, and judgmental glances made it clear how they truly felt. Victoria seemed to enjoy creating situations where I would feel out of place. She loved hosting extravagant dinner parties where wealthy friends, business partners, and investors filled the mansion with loud conversations and expensive perfumes. The guests often arrived in luxury cars and wore clothes that looked like they came straight from fashion magazines. I would sit quietly at the table, trying my best to blend in, but Victoria always managed to pull attention toward me. "Oh, Emily, tell them about your little office job," she once said during one of those dinners. The guests looked at me with polite curiosity, but I could see the hidden amusement in Victoria's smile. To her, my career was something small and unimpressive compared to the massive business empire her family controlled. I calmly explained that I worked as a financial analyst for a corporate consulting firm. Most of the guests nodded politely, but the conversation quickly shifted back to investments, luxury resorts, and international deals worth millions of dollars. Victoria leaned back in her chair with a satisfied expression, as if she had just proven her point. What she never understood was that my job was far more complex than she imagined. My work involved analyzing company finances, identifying hidden risks, and reviewing complicated investment structures. I spent hours studying balance sheets, funding agreements, and corporate reports. It required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to recognize patterns that others might overlook. One evening, Daniel's father decided to impress his guests by presenting his newest business project. Everyone gathered in the living room where a large screen displayed a sleek presentation filled with glossy images of beaches, luxury villas, and infinity pools overlooking the ocean. He stood confidently at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced proudly, "this will be our biggest development yet." The project was a massive luxury coastal resort. According to the presentation, it would include 5-star hotels, private villas, shopping areas, and exclusive beach clubs. The total investment was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Investors in the room listened with interest as he explained how the project would attract wealthy tourists from all over the world. The room was filled with admiration. Guests complimented his vision, and some even discussed potential partnerships. Victoria watched proudly as her husband received praise for his business success. I sat quietly on the couch, observing the presentation like everyone else. But as the slides continued, something unusual caught my attention. The numbers didn't feel right. It wasn't something obvious at first. The presentation looked professional and convincing. However, certain details about the funding structure seemed strangely complicated. The project involved multiple companies, international investors, and several layers of financing that connected in ways that were difficult to follow. Most people in the room were impressed by the scale of the project. But because of my experience, I noticed small inconsistencies that others would probably ignore. One slide mentioned funding from several offshore investment groups. Another showed loans issued through smaller companies that I had never heard of before. The more I watched, the more questions started forming in my mind. Why was the financing structured this way? Why were there so many separate companies involved in the same project? And why did some of the numbers seem slightly inconsistent with the scale of the investment being described? At first, I told myself I was probably overthinking it. After all, Daniel's father was an experienced businessman. He had built a powerful company over many years. Surely he knew what he was doing. Still, the curiosity stayed in the back of my mind long after the presentation ended. Later that night, when Daniel had already fallen asleep, I sat at my laptop and began searching for information about the company managing the resort project. Public business records, investment announcements, and financial reports were all available online if you knew where to look. What started as simple curiosity slowly turned into something much more serious. The company responsible for managing the project had been created only a year earlier. That alone wasn't unusual, since many companies form special entities for large developments. But as I continued researching, I noticed something strange. The same names kept appearing in multiple companies connected to the project. Some of those companies were registered in offshore financial centers known for limited transparency. Others had very little public information about their actual operations. It was as if the entire investment structure had been designed to make it extremely difficult to trace where the money was really coming from. The deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Several loans funding the project appeared to be connected to companies that had no clear business activity. In financial terms, they looked suspiciously similar to shell companies. Their purpose seemed less about running a real business and more about moving money through complicated channels. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. There was another problem too. Some of the financial obligations tied to the project were extremely risky. If the resort failed to generate profits quickly, the companies involved could face serious financial pressure. Investors might demand immediate repayment, and banks could freeze assets. The realization made my heart beat faster. Daniel's family had spent years mocking me for being the girl who came from nothing. They believed their wealth made them untouchable. But the financial structure behind this massive resort project looked fragile in a way that most people wouldn't notice. If regulators or investors ever examined the details closely, they might start asking difficult questions about where the money was going and why the funding structure looked so unusual. For the first time since joining Daniel's family, I understood something important. The powerful empire that surrounded them might not be as strong as it appeared. Behind the luxury homes, expensive cars, and confident smiles, there could be a financial problem large enough to shake everything they had built. And if that problem ever came to light, the same family that laughed at my modest background might suddenly find themselves facing a situation they could not control. A situation where the woman they dismissed as unimportant might be one of the very few people capable of understanding exactly what was about to happen a few weeks after I discovered the strange financial details behind the resort project. Life at Daniel's family mansion continued as if nothing had changed. The luxurious dinners, polite smiles, and quiet mockery were still part of every gathering. No one had any idea what I had been researching late at night, and I kept it that way. I didn't confront anyone or mention what I had found. Instead, I watched and listened carefully whenever Daniel's father talked about his new investment. The more he spoke about the project in public, the more confident he sounded. He bragged about the future success of the resort to friends, investors, and business partners. To everyone around him, he appeared calm and proud, like a man completely certain of his decisions. But every time I heard him speak about the project, I remembered the documents I had seen and the complicated financial web hidden beneath the surface. It made the entire situation feel strange, almost like watching a carefully constructed illusion. One evening, Victoria announced she was hosting another large dinner party at the mansion. These parties had become a regular event. Wealthy guests from across the city would gather there to discuss business, politics, and investments while enjoying expensive food and wine. It was also the perfect setting for Victoria to show off her family's wealth and social status. When Daniel told me about the party, I felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and quiet frustration. I already knew how the evening would go. There would be elegant conversations about money and success, and at some point someone would make a comment that reminded me I was still considered the outsider. The night of the dinner arrived, and the mansion was glowing with lights. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and soft music echoed through the large living room where guests were already gathering. The long dining table was decorated with silver candles, crystal glasses, and plates that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Victoria greeted her guests with a bright smile, moving gracefully through the room like the perfect host. She wore a beautiful designer dress, and her confident posture made it clear she enjoyed every moment of attention. When she noticed me standing beside Daniel, she smiled in a way that felt polite but distant. "Emily, dear," she said, "make sure you stay close tonight. Some of our guests might find your background very interesting." Her tone sounded light, but I understood the meaning behind the words. To her, my life story was something entertaining to share with her wealthy friends. As dinner began, the room filled with conversation. Guests discussed new investment opportunities, property markets, and international travel plans. Daniel's father sat at the center of the table, leading most of the discussions. People respected his opinions and often asked for his advice about business decisions. At one point, the conversation turned toward the coastal resort project again. Several investors were curious about its progress. Daniel's father leaned back confidently in his chair and began explaining how construction would begin soon. He described the luxury villas, the private beaches, and the huge profits investors could expect once the resort opened. The guests listened with admiration. Victoria glanced toward me and smiled again. "Oh, Emily probably doesn't understand much about these things," she said casually. "Finance can be very complicated." A few people laughed softly. I felt the familiar silence fall around me as everyone waited to see how I would react. For a moment I considered saying nothing, just like I had done many times before. It would have been easier to smile politely and let the conversation continue. But something inside me had changed after discovering the truth about the project. I calmly placed my glass on the table and looked toward Victoria. "Actually," I said quietly, "finance is exactly what I work with every day." The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel's father stopped speaking and glanced in my direction. His confident expression didn't disappear yet, but I could see the slight curiosity in his eyes. I continued speaking in the same calm tone. "Especially when it comes to investment structures," I added. A few guests leaned forward with interest, unsure where the conversation was going. Daniel's father gave a small smile, as if he thought I was simply trying to join the discussion. "That's good to hear," he said. "Finance is a fascinating field." I nodded slowly. "It definitely is," I replied, "particularly when offshore companies are involved." The moment the words left my mouth, something changed in the room. Daniel's father's smile froze for a brief second. It was a small reaction, but I noticed it immediately. I continued before anyone could interrupt. "Sometimes complex structures are used to manage international investments," I said carefully. "But they can also make things very difficult to trace." Now several guests were watching us with growing curiosity. I wasn't accusing anyone directly. I was simply describing financial practices in general terms. But the way Daniel's father suddenly sat straighter in his chair told me he understood exactly what I was hinting at. I took another small sip of water before speaking again. "Especially when multiple shell companies are involved in the same project." This time the silence around the table became heavy. Victoria looked confused, clearly unsure why the conversation had taken this direction. Chloe glanced between her father and me, sensing the tension but not understanding it completely. Daniel's father placed his fork down slowly. His eyes were fixed on me now. I spoke one final sentence, keeping my voice calm and respectful. "I just hope all the investors in the resort project fully understand how their money is being structured." No one said anything for several seconds. The guests exchanged quiet looks, unsure how to react. Some of them were experienced investors, and they understood enough about finance to realize my comment wasn't random. Victoria quickly forced a laugh and tried to lighten the atmosphere. "Well, that's enough business talk for dinner," she said brightly. "Let's enjoy the evening." But the mood had already changed. Conversations restarted slowly, but the excitement that had filled the room earlier was gone. A quiet tension now hung over the table. Daniel's father remained unusually quiet for the rest of dinner. From time to time I noticed him glancing in my direction with a serious expression, as if he was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew. The dinner party ended earlier than usual that night. Guests thanked Victoria and began leaving the mansion one by one. As the last car disappeared down the driveway, a servant approached me and politely asked if I could come to Daniel's father's office. When I entered the room, he was already standing near the large window, looking out at the dark garden. He slowly turned around to face me. For the first time since I had met him, the confident businessman who once laughed at my background, no longer looked completely in control of the situation. When I stepped into Daniel's father's office that night, the atmosphere felt completely different from the confident energy he usually carried around the mansion. The large room was quiet except for the faint sound of the air conditioner. The walls were covered with expensive paintings and shelves filled with business awards, but none of that seemed important at that moment. He stood near the window, looking out into the dark garden. The lights outside illuminated the tall trees and the perfectly maintained lawn. But his attention didn't seem focused on the view. It felt like he was trying to gather his thoughts before speaking. When he finally turned toward me, his expression was serious in a way I had never seen before. For years, he had always appeared confident, almost untouchable. He was the kind of businessman who controlled conversations and made people listen carefully whenever he spoke. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes. A hint of concern. He slowly walked toward his desk and gestured for me to sit down. I took the chair across from him without saying anything. The silence between us lasted several seconds, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt like both of us understood that this conversation was important. Finally, he spoke. "What exactly were you trying to say at dinner tonight?" he asked. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. I kept my tone equally calm. "I wasn't trying to say anything specific," I replied. "I was simply discussing financial structures." He watched me carefully, as if studying every word I said. "You mentioned offshore companies and shell corporations," he said slowly. "That's not casual dinner conversation." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Not usually," I admitted. The room became quiet again. He placed both hands on the desk and looked directly at me. "How much do you know?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I thought about the long months of subtle insults, the laughter at family dinners, and the countless times they had treated me like someone who didn't belong in their world. Then I answered honestly. "I know enough to understand that the resort project isn't as simple as it looks," I said. His shoulders stiffened slightly. "And?" he asked. "And I know the financing structure is extremely complicated," I continued. "Multiple companies are involved, many of them registered in offshore jurisdictions. Some of those companies appear to exist only on paper." He sighed quietly and sat down in his chair. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The powerful businessman who controlled a huge empire now looked like someone carrying a heavy burden. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its usual authority. "You've been investigating my company," he said. "Not your company," I corrected gently. "Just the resort project." He rubbed his forehead slowly. "That project is very important to our expansion plans," he said. "I understand," I replied. Another silence filled the room. Then something surprising happened. Instead of denying everything or becoming angry, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, as if he had already accepted something inevitable. When he opened them again, his expression was different. Tired. "The structure is complicated for a reason," he admitted. Those words alone were enough to confirm what I had suspected. He continued speaking carefully, choosing his words with caution. The project required a large amount of capital very quickly. Traditional banks were hesitant to provide the full financing at first, so some alternative investment channels were used. "Offshore investors," I said. He nodded slowly. "Some of them prefer privacy," he explained. "And the shell companies?" I asked. "They help manage the funding flow." I could hear the defensiveness in his explanation, but underneath it there was also concern. "What happens if regulators start asking questions?" I asked calmly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the papers on his desk as if searching for a solution that wasn't there. "That's exactly what we're trying to avoid," he said quietly. For the first time since entering the office, I truly saw how fragile the situation had become. The massive resort project that everyone admired at dinner parties was actually balanced on a complicated financial structure that depended on everything working perfectly. If any part of that system was examined too closely, it could cause serious problems. "What do you want?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me slightly off guard. "I'm not asking for anything," I replied. He studied my face carefully. "You could cause serious damage if you spoke about this publicly," he said. "I know," I answered, "and yet you brought it up at dinner tonight." I thought about that moment for a second. "I wanted you to understand something," I said. "What?" he asked. "That I'm not the ignorant girl your family thinks I am." He looked down at his desk again. For the first time since I had met him, he didn't try to argue with that statement. The conversation ended soon after that. I left the office quietly and returned to the bedroom where Daniel was already asleep. But the tension in the house didn't disappear after that night. In fact, the situation became even more complicated. Only 2 weeks later, news began spreading through financial circles that regulators were reviewing several large investment projects across the region. One of those projects happened to be the coastal resort development. At first, it was just rumors. Then investors started asking questions. Soon after that, banks began requesting additional documentation regarding certain financial transactions connected to the project. Within days, the entire atmosphere around Daniel's family business began to change. Lawyers started visiting the mansion regularly. Business meetings that were once casual and confident became tense and secretive. Phone calls happened behind closed doors, and long discussions stretched late into the night. Victoria's usual elegance began to fade as stress replaced her confident smile. Chloe stopped making jokes at family dinners. The house that once felt like a palace full of celebration slowly turned into something else, a place filled with quiet anxiety. News articles started appearing online discussing possible financial irregularities connected to large development projects. None of them mentioned Daniel's family directly yet, but the timing was too close to ignore. Investors who had once praised the resort project were now demanding clear explanations. Some of them threatened to withdraw their funding completely if the situation became more serious. Every day the pressure grew stronger, and slowly, the powerful business empire that had always looked so perfect from the outside began showing its first visible cracks. The same family that once mocked my background now faced the terrifying possibility that their wealth, reputation, and influence could disappear if the financial structure behind their most ambitious project collapsed under the weight of investigation and public scrutiny. The mansion that once felt like a place of celebration and pride slowly turned into a house filled with tension. Only a few weeks earlier, it had been full of laughter, music, and guests discussing million-dollar deals over expensive wine. Now the same halls were quiet, and the cheerful energy that once surrounded Daniel's family had disappeared. Every morning seemed to bring new problems. Daniel's father spent most of his time locked inside his office with lawyers and financial advisors. Important documents covered his desk, and phone calls lasted for hours as he spoke with investors who were growing more nervous each day. The confident businessman who once controlled every conversation sounded tired and careful, choosing his words very cautiously. Victoria, who used to host glamorous dinners and social gatherings, had stopped organizing parties completely. The woman who loved attention and admiration now avoided public events. Instead of welcoming guests with a bright smile, she spent long hours quietly reading news updates on her tablet. Chloe had changed as well. The playful sarcasm and small jokes she once directed toward me had completely disappeared. Whenever we passed each other in the hallway, she looked distracted and anxious. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath. The investigation surrounding the resort project was slowly growing larger. At first, it had only been a routine review by financial regulators, but soon it expanded into something more serious. Investors wanted detailed explanations about how their money was being used, and banks demanded additional documentation about the complicated funding structure. Some investors became nervous enough to threaten withdrawing their support entirely. If that happened, the financial pressure on the company could become overwhelming. One evening, Daniel returned home looking unusually stressed. He had spent most of the day speaking with his father and several company executives. "They're trying to stabilize everything," he told me quietly. "But it's getting complicated." I already understood how fragile the situation was. The resort project had been built on a network of complicated financial agreements. As long as every part of the system worked perfectly, the project could succeed and generate enormous profits. But now that regulators and investors were asking questions, every small detail was being examined closely. Even minor inconsistencies could trigger major problems. A few days later, Daniel's father asked to speak with me again. This time the meeting happened in the dining room instead of his office. The long table where luxurious dinners once took place now held stacks of papers and financial reports. He looked exhausted when I entered the room. For several seconds he didn't say anything. Then he slowly pushed a group of documents toward me. "These are the latest financial reports for the resort project," he said. I sat down and began reviewing them carefully. Some of the numbers were exactly what I expected to see, but others revealed just how serious the situation had become. Certain investors were considering legal action if they didn't receive clearer answers about the funding structure. "This could escalate very quickly," I said after a few minutes. He nodded slowly. "I know." For the first time since I had met him, his voice carried no arrogance at all. "You saw the risks before anyone else," he admitted. The word surprised me slightly. For years he had treated me like someone whose opinion didn't matter. Now he was openly acknowledging that I had understood the problem long before the situation became public. "What are you planning to do?" I asked. "We're trying to restructure the financing agreements," he said. "But the process is extremely complicated." He paused before continuing, "And we may need help." The meaning behind his words was obvious. The same woman his family once mocked for having a simple background was now one of the few people capable of analyzing the complex financial structure threatening their empire. For a moment, I thought about everything that had happened since I first joined the family. The jokes about my job, the comments about my upbringing, and the countless moments when they made it clear I wasn't considered equal to them. Part of me could have simply walked away. Watching their empire collapse would have been an easy form of revenge. But I also thought about Daniel. He had never treated me with the same arrogance as the rest of his family. Despite his reluctance to challenge them directly, he had always cared about me and tried to support me in his own way. So instead of refusing, I agreed to review the entire financial structure with their advisors. Over the next several weeks, I spent long hours studying contracts, investment agreements, and loan arrangements connected to the resort project. The system was complicated, but it wasn't impossible to repair. Many of the problems came from poor organization rather than deliberate wrongdoing. Working together with the legal and financial teams, We began restructuring the agreements in a way that was clearer and more transparent for investors. Some risky loans were renegotiated, and several shell companies were removed from the funding chain to simplify the structure. The process was exhausting, but slowly the situation began improving. Investors who had been threatening legal action started relaxing once they saw the new financial plans. Banks agreed to maintain their support as long as the restructuring continued. News articles that once hinted at scandal gradually disappeared as the project regained stability. One evening, after weeks of constant work, the family gathered quietly in the dining room again. This time, there were no piles of legal documents on the table. Daniel's father looked around the room before finally speaking. "We would not have solved this without Emily's help," he said. The room fell silent. Victoria looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I misjudged you," she admitted softly. Those 3 words carried more weight than any apology she had ever given. Chloe also avoided my eyes for a moment before quietly thanking me. The atmosphere in the room felt very different from the first dinners I had attended in that house. There were no mocking smiles or hidden jokes. Only quiet respect. Daniel squeezed my hand gently under the table. The girl they once introduced as Daniel's charity project had become the person who saved their most ambitious investment. And although the family would probably never forget how close they came to losing everything, they had finally learned something that wealth had prevented them from understanding for many years. Money might build an empire, but character and intelligence were what truly determined who deserved respect, and that's how the people who once mocked me for being not good enough ended up realizing the truth the hard way. They believed money made them powerful. They believed wealth gave them the right to judge others. But in the end, the person they respected the least was the one who understood their world better than anyone else. Sometimes karma doesn't come with revenge or destruction. Sometimes karma simply reveals the truth and forces people to face their own mistakes. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful revenge stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. And remember, never underestimate someone just because of where they come from. You never know who might be the one holding the power when everything starts to fall apart.